She was supposed to use that money for tuition. Instead, Wren Callahan handed over her entire college fund to buy an old 1947 Beechcraft Bonanza, sun-bleached, oil-stained, and buried in the back corner of a forgotten airfield. Everyone told her it was a mistake, that she was chasing ghosts. But what none of them knew was that this plane wasn't just a machine, it was the last thread in a story that refused to be grounded. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. And if stories like this lift something in your chest, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode might just take you even higher. The envelope had been sitting on Wren Callahan's desk for weeks thick, manila, and filled with college admissions letters she hadn't opened. The dreams she'd once held so tightly had loosened their grip somewhere between graduation and grief. Her father had died 6 months earlier, a retired crop duster who used to spin stories and airplanes with equal elegance. He was the reason she fell in love with the sky. But now he was gone, and all that was left was the money he'd saved for her education and a voice inside her that said school wasn't where she was supposed to be. It was a Thursday morning when she saw the listing. 1,947 Beechcraft Bonanza. Not airworthy. Needs full restoration. 17,500 as island. Most people would have laughed and kept scrolling. Wren stared at the photo, a ghost of a plane, wings stripped, nose cone crumpled, sitting in the corner of a rusted-out hangar like a relic someone had forgotten to bury. Her thumb hovered over the contact button, then pressed. She didn't tell anyone. 3 days later, she stood on the cracked tarmac of a small regional airstrip an hour outside town. The wind was sharp, tugging her hoodie tight around her ribs. The hangar creaked as the door rolled open, light spilling across stained concrete and the skeletal frame of the aircraft. Its aluminum skin was faded to gray. Moss had begun creeping up one landing strut. One of the windows was missing, and still her heart kicked once in her chest. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't even promising, but it was hers. The man selling it wore a cap from a defunct flight school and walked with a limp. Said he'd flown the Bonanza a dozen times in the late 70s before it was grounded. She was a fighter, he said, patting the wing like an old dog. Had her own mind. Bit back more than once. He handed her the keys. They were small and light, worn smooth by years of palms long gone. Wren took them like they were made of glass. No inspection, no hesitation, just a signature, a handshake, and a promise she didn't yet understand. She wired the money that afternoon. The man didn't ask questions, just smiled a little too sadly. You planning to fly her? He asked. Wren looked at the fuselage sun, scorched, ribs exposed, propeller blade bent at a crooked angle. She nodded anyway. Yeah, one day. That night, she drove home with the keys on her lap, the metal cool against her skin. Her phone buzzed with texts she ignored. Friends asking about orientation, dorm rooms, majors. She stared out the windshield at the passing fields and whispered to no one in particular, "What the hell did I just do?" But in the silence that followed, something stirred. Not regret, not fear, something quieter, like a door had opened somewhere she couldn't see yet, and all it had taken was a key. The next morning, Wren arrived at the airstrip just as the sun peeled over the tree line, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. The hangar groaned when she opened it, its rollers rusted from disuse. Inside, the plane looked even worse in daylight. Dust coated every surface. The once polished prop now looked like driftwood, and spiderwebs clung to the yoke inside the cockpit. It didn't look like a machine that could ever fly again. It looked like a tomb. Still, she stepped forward, ran her fingers along the rivets. The metal was cold and coarse, flaking in places. She pulled open the pilot side door and winced as it squealed. The seat cushions were torn, the control panel a faded mosaic of dials and needles. Her father would have whistled low and said, "You sure about this one, bird?" And she would have nodded anyway. Because this wasn't about logic. It was about honoring a promise she never got to make. She began by sweeping. She didn't even bring tools on day one, just gloves, trash bags, and a broom. She didn't know what else to do, so she started with what she could. Cleared out the dead leaves that had blown in over the years. Picked up the shards of broken plexiglass. Bagged up a cracked radio, a decaying mouse nest, and 2 bird feathers she decided to keep. By noon, her hoodie was streaked with oil smudges and her throat tasted like aluminum. She hadn't eaten, hadn't noticed. A couple of workers from the next hangar over walked by, peeking in. One raised an eyebrow. "You bought that thing?" She nodded. He shook his head and chuckled, not unkindly. "Good luck, sweetheart. That plane's more rust than rivet." She smiled back without saying a word. If she opened her mouth, she wasn't sure what would come out. That night, back in her studio apartment, Wren sat cross-legged on the floor, with the plane's original maintenance manual spread out in front of her. It smelled like mildew and diesel, its pages brittle from years in a tool chest. She traced diagrams of the electrical system, engine assembly, fuel lines. It might as well have been a foreign language. But she stared anyway, letting the shapes and numbers soak in like a second skin. The next few days blurred. She worked in silence. No music, no distractions. Just the rhythm of sweeping, wiping, removing, discarding. The physical labor kept her from thinking too hard. But the mental weight was louder. Doubts crept in during quiet moments when the hangar echoed too much, when the sun dipped below the roofline and left the cockpit in shadow. She had no sponsors. No backup plan. Just a plane that didn't fly, and a life that no longer followed a flight path. But she wasn't afraid of work. She was afraid of wasting something that might have mattered. And beneath all that rust, something still mattered. She could feel it in the way her hands moved slow, careful, reverent. Like she wasn't cleaning a machine. She was waking one up. By the end of her first week, Wren had memorized the smell of the hangar. Oil-soaked concrete, dust, old rubber, and something faintly metallic, like the scent of ghosts. She'd cleared out most of the obvious debris, but the Bonanza still felt like a stranger. She hadn't even tried to touch the engine yet. It sat under the cowling like a clenched fist, daring her to pry it open. Instead, she turned her attention to the cockpit, hoping the inside would give her answers the outside refused to. The glove compartment was jammed shut, rust sealing the hinge like a secret. She wedged a flathead screwdriver beneath the lip, gritting her teeth as she pried it open inch by inch. It finally gave with a pop, and a puff of dust rose like smoke. Inside was a stack of yellowed papers, curled at the edges, bound loosely by a cracked rubber band. A pilot's logbook sat on top, its leather cover worn smooth. She flipped it open. The name inside was written in ink that had bled through the page: Captain Georgia Ames. Wren paused. The entries spanned decades, starting in the late 1940s. Hundreds of handwritten notations, weather conditions, passenger weights, cargo types. Some entries were terse. Others had small notes in the margins, like, "Tailwind made her sing today," or, "Don't trust that mechanic in Salt Lake again." Near the back of the logbook, one page had been dog-eared. Wren unfolded it and found something wedged inside a letter, folded twice, and sealed with a thin strip of faded blue tape. The ink on the outside had nearly vanished, but she could still make out the date. June 12, 1951. And a name, for whoever finds this. She hesitated before unfolding it, her fingers trembling. The paper felt like it might dissolve. The handwriting was looping, elegant, unmistakably female. "If you found this, then I didn't make it back. That's okay. I knew the risks. I knew what Echo meant and what she carried. This plane has more than metal in her bones. She has purpose. Please take care of her. There's a map behind the panel, don't let it be forgotten." Wren sat back in the pilot's seat, heart hammering against her ribs. Echo. That was the plane's name. Not just a name, but a code. A call. She looked around the cockpit as if seeing it for the first time. She touched the yoke with new reverence. This wasn't just an aircraft someone abandoned. It was a vessel with memory, stitched into every bolt. She reached for the radio panel, the one just to the right of the throttle quadrant. It looked newer than the rest, maybe replaced sometime in the 70s. With careful fingers, she unscrewed the plate. Her breath caught when it loosened. Tucked behind the panel, taped to the frame with disintegrating cloth strips, was a small weathered map. The ink was faint, but clear enough. A looping route traced through western mountain ranges, Colorado, Utah, Nevada. 3 airfields circled in red, one marked with a hand-drawn star. Wren didn't sleep that night. She spread the map out on her kitchen counter, weighed down at the corners with soup cans and a chipped coffee mug. The paper felt older than anything she'd ever touched, delicate as a memory. The flight path didn't make sense. It skipped major airports, looped through obscure landing strips, some of which no longer showed up on modern charts. The red star sat in the middle of nowhere, flat desert, framed by mountain ridges. No label, no note, just a mark, like someone saying, "Here, look here." She typed Captain Georgia Ames into her laptop, but all she found were archived newsletters from old flying clubs. One black and white photo surfaced, clipped from a 1950 aviation bulletin. A woman in slacks and aviator sunglasses stood in front of a Beechcraft Bonanza, her expression unreadable. The caption beneath simply read, "Captain Georgia Ames prepares for her final civilian cargo run, Summer 51. That was it. No details. No history. Just silence. The next day, Wren stood in front of the Bonanza and stared at it like it might answer her. She traced the fuselage with her fingers until she reached the name barely visible beneath years of oxidation. Echo. Her throat tightened. She whispered it once, like a prayer. That was when she decided she couldn't keep fumbling through restoration videos online. She needed help. Actual help. Not YouTube tutorials or scanned service manuals. Real knowledge. So she swallowed her pride and drove 5 blocks down to the corner house where Roy Lancer lived. Roy was 72. A retired flight mechanic who'd once kept crop dusters flying with little more than a wrench and sheer stubbornness. He hadn't spoken to her much since her father passed, but she remembered his voice from her childhood, low, slow, with the kind of confidence that made you believe a bailing wire could fix anything. She knocked. He answered in a grease-stained flannel and boots that had seen more tarmac than most commercial jets. His brow lifted when he saw her. "Wren Callahan. Haven't seen you in a while." She didn't waste time. "I bought a plane." He blinked. "You bought what now?" "Bonanza. 47. Doesn't fly." A long pause. Then, to her relief, a chuckle. "Hell, none of 'em do at that age." She handed him a folded photo of Echo. He stared at it for a moment, lips tightening. "Looks familiar. I need help." Roy didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for his coat and keys. "You got coffee?" Back at the hangar, he walked the perimeter of the aircraft with slow, deliberate steps, tapped the wing, ran his hand over the stabilizer, peered inside the cowling without saying a word. Finally, he exhaled through his nose. "It's a mess. I know, but she's worth it." Wren looked up, startled. "You think so?" "I know so," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Because planes like this, they don't find you by accident." And just like that, she wasn't alone anymore. Roy came back the next morning, toolbox in one hand, thermos in the other. He didn't wait for an invitation. Just set his tools on the workbench, took a long swig of coffee, and said, "Let's see what we're working with." Wren had been there since dawn, combing over the logbook again and again, the words of Georgia Ames still pulsing in her mind. She handed the old book to him, and for the first time, she saw his expression soften. He thumbed through the brittle pages with the kind of reverence you'd give a family album. "She flew this bird?" he murmured. Wren nodded. "And she named her Echo." Roy said nothing for a long while, just rested a weathered hand on the fuselage, as though paying respects. Finally, he looked at Wren. "You know what that name means, right? Echo's not just a call, it's a response, a sound that refuses to die out." Wren swallowed, the truth of it landing heavier than she expected. This wasn't just restoration. This was resurrection. Over the following weeks, they began peeling Echo back layer by layer. Rusted panels came off with reluctant groans. Wiring was traced, catalogued, sometimes yanked free with disgusted mutters from Roy. Wren found herself learning faster than she thought possible, listening to him explain magnetos, carburetors, and control cables like sacred scripture. She wrote notes in the margins of the manual, smudged with oil and pencil dust. Her hands, once soft from books and keyboards, grew calloused and cut. And yet, she'd never felt stronger. It was during one of those long afternoons that Wren uncovered something hidden beneath peeling paint on the tail. A faint stenciled marking, letters almost erased by decades of neglect. Gay, 17. She asked Roy what it meant, but he just stared at it for a long time, jaw tightening. Could be a tail number, he said finally, or it could be something else. He wouldn't elaborate, but she caught the way his eyes flickered with recognition he didn't want to admit. That night, back in her apartment, Wren searched the number. The results were scarce, buried deep in scanned government archives, but one headline surfaced. Civilian aircraft, GA-17, missing over Nevada, 1,950. 1. Her chest tightened. The name listed as pilot? Captain Georgia Ames. Echo hadn't just been forgotten, she had vanished. And now, somehow, the plane sat in her hangar. The realization made her stomach twist. She closed her laptop and stared at the ceiling, sleepless. She thought of the map taped behind the panel, of the star scrawled in the middle of nowhere. This wasn't just about restoring an airplane. This was about finding out why Georgia Ames never came back, and why Echo had. The next morning, Wren entered the hangar differently. Not just as a mechanic's apprentice, not just as a dreamer, clinging to her father's memory. She walked in like someone carrying a responsibility she hadn't asked for, but couldn't put down. She laid her hand against the cold aluminum and whispered, "All right, Echo, tell me what you want me to hear." The map haunted her. Every night, Wren unfolded it on her kitchen counter, tracing the loops and circles with the edge of her finger until the paper nearly tore. She couldn't shake the image of that star, drawn in a bold hand like a promise or a warning. It wasn't near any town she recognized, just desert and rock, emptiness stretching for miles. And yet, whoever marked it believed it mattered enough to hide behind an instrument panel for 70 years. She brought it to the hangar the following morning, rolled tight in her backpack. Roy was already there, halfway inside the cowling, muttering about seized pistons. When she showed him the map, he froze. For a long moment, he just stared at it, his face unreadable. "Where'd you find this?" he asked. "Behind the radio panel," Wren said quietly. "There was a letter from Georgia Ames. Said not to let this be forgotten." Roy exhaled slowly, like he was letting something go he'd held for decades. "I heard stories about her," he admitted. "She wasn't just another pilot. She flew contracts nobody else would touch. Relief missions. Cargo runs into bad weather. Some say she carried more than supplies, letters, codes, maybe things the government didn't want traced. But I always thought it was rumor." He tapped the map. "Now I'm not so sure." They spread the map across the wing, both leaning over it. Roy traced the route with a calloused finger. "These strips out west. I flew near some of them back in my day. Most are gone now. That star, though? That's rough country. No reason to land out there unless you were hiding." His words sent a chill down Wren's spine. What had Georgia been carrying? And why did she believe Echo was more than just a plane? For the next few hours, Wren worked distractedly. Every turn of the wrench felt like part of a bigger puzzle. She wanted answers, but the only way forward was through sweat and grease. So she cleaned, polished, pulled seats, cataloged wires. Her hands grew blistered, but her determination sharpened. Each bolt loosened was another step toward uncovering Echo's story. Later that night, long after Roy had gone home, Wren stayed behind. The hangar was quiet, except for the echo of her own movements. She sat in the pilot's seat, with the logbook on her lap, reading George's final entries again. One line caught her eye, scrawled hastily. "Echo isn't just carrying me anymore." The words burned into her chest. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against the yoke, the weight of mystery pressing hard against her. For the first time since buying the plane, she felt fear not of failing the restoration, but of what she might uncover if she succeeded. And yet, as she closed her eyes, she realized the fear didn't stop her hands from trembling with something else entirely: anticipation. Echo was speaking to her, in rivets and rust and faint pencil marks on a forgotten map, and Wren knew she couldn't stop listening. The first time they tried to breathe life into Echo's engine, Wren's hands wouldn't stop shaking. Weeks of cleaning, disassembling, and cataloging had led to this moment. Roy stood beside her at the workbench, wiping his palms on a rag, the faint smell of aviation fuel clinging to the air. "All right," he said, voice steady. "Let's see if she still remembers how to sing." Wren turned the key, and the starter whined reluctantly. The engine coughed once, twice, and then a hollow clunk echoed through the hangar. Smoke puffed from the cowling. Her heart leapt into her throat, but she pressed again, teeth gritted, begging the engine to turn. For a heartbeat, it sputtered alive, just enough to tease hope before a sharp pop rang out, followed by a thin lick of flame curling beneath the exhaust manifold. "Kill it!" Roy barked. Wren twisted the key off and jumped back as he smothered the flame with a heavy rag. Smoke billowed up, acrid and stinging, filling the hangar with the smell of burned oil and singed cloth. Wren coughed hard, eyes watering, panic rising like a tide. Her arms trembled as she pressed them against her knees, trying to breathe. Roy stayed calm, even as sweat dripped down his temples. "Old engines fight back," he muttered, fanning the smoke with his rag. "They've been asleep too long. Doesn't mean they're dead." But Wren's chest was heavy with failure. She stared at the blackened patch under the cowling, at the scorch mark now painted across the aluminum, and felt the weight of every voice that told her she'd thrown her life away. That night she didn't go home. She sat cross-legged on the hangar floor, the logbook beside her, Echo looming silent and charred in the half-light. The letter from Georgia Ames replayed in her mind. This plane has more than metal in her bones. She has purpose. Wren whispered aloud, voice cracked. "What purpose, Georgia? What am I doing here?" Silence answered her, broken only by the groan of the hangar doors shifting in the night breeze. Her father's face rose in her memory, hands black with grease, eyes soft with patience. He never let her quit, not when she stripped bolts, not when she dropped tools. He always said the same thing. "Engines are stubborn. So are you. That's why you're meant for each other." By dawn, Wren was still there, hair tangled, clothes stained with soot. She stood up slowly, wiped her hands on her jeans, and walked to the tool chest. One by one, she laid the parts out on the bench. Every piston, every valve, every stubborn bolt she'd cursed the day before. She would strip the engine down to its bones and rebuild it piece by piece if she had to. Roy found her hours later, sleeves rolled, grease streaked across her cheek, eyes sharp with a fire the night's smoke hadn't managed to choke out. He didn't say a word, just set down a box of fresh spark plugs and nodded. Together, they went back to work. Echo had fought her. Hard. But Wren wasn't ready to walk away. If this plane carried a story worth dying for, then she'd bleed for it, before she let it stay silent. The weeks that followed tested Wren in ways she hadn't expected. Every morning she rose before dawn, her muscles still sore from the day before, and drove to the hangar with coffee she barely tasted. The engine lay in pieces on the workbench, its components lined up like relics from a forgotten shrine. She cleaned each one by hand, scraping, scrubbing, polishing until her fingertips were raw. Sometimes Roy hovered nearby, offering gruff instructions. Other times he let her labor in silence, only stepping in when her frustration threatened to spill over. One Saturday afternoon, she looked up to see a stranger leaning in the hangar doorway. A tall man with weathered skin and a cap embroidered with faded pilot wings. He introduced himself as Hank, a veteran who'd once flown supply runs out west. Roy had called him, though he hadn't said a word to Wren about it. Hank shuffled closer, his eyes narrowing at the sight of Echo. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "Didn't think I'd see this bird again." Wren's heart raced. "You knew her?" "Knew of her," Hank corrected, running his hand along the wing. "Georgia Ames was a legend, not because she was fearless though she was, but because she flew when others wouldn't. Relief runs to towns buried by snowstorms, cargo no one wanted responsibility for. She called this plane Echo because she believed stories don't die, they reverberate, and she swore this ship carried one worth remembering." The word struck Wren deeper than she expected. Stories don't die, they reverberate. She thought of her father, of the way he used to stand in their backyard pointing out contrails streaking across the sky, whispering, "Every flight carries someone's heartbeat." Hank stayed for hours, rolling up his sleeves without hesitation. Together the three of them wrestled with the stubborn engine, their laughter echoing off the metal walls whenever a bolt refused to budge. It wasn't just repair work anymore. It was communion, shared through grease-stained hands and stories swapped between turns of the wrench. As they worked, Hank studied the map Wren had found, his brow furrowed as he traced the route. "These strips, I remember them," he said slowly. "Back in the day, we heard whispers of a relief drop that never made it. Rumors said it wasn't just food or medicine being carried. Could have been documents. Maybe something tied to the war." He tapped the star with one calloused finger. Whatever it was, Georgia was the one trusted to take it. And she never came back. That night, Wren lay awake staring at the ceiling, the word legacy humming in her head. She realized Echo wasn't just about Georgia's story, or her father's, or even the mystery of the map. Echo was about carrying forward what others had left unfinished, whether that meant rebuilding a plane, honoring a life, or refusing to let history sink into silence. By the following week, the engine was reassembled. They mounted it back onto the frame with careful precision. For the first time, Echo looked whole again, though scars of rust and time still marred her skin. Wren wiped the sweat from her brow, stepping back. She could almost feel the plane breathing beneath her hands. And in that moment, she knew this wasn't just restoration. It was inheritance. The morning of the test flight dawned pale and cold, the kind of sky that seemed to hold its breath. Wren stood on the tarmac with her helmet tucked under one arm, heart pounding like it was trying to escape her chest. Echo gleamed in the light, patched, painted, and whole in a way she hadn't been for decades. The scars were still visible if you looked closely, but to Wren, they were marks of survival, proof that the plane carried stories deeper than aluminum and rivets. Roy and Hank stood nearby, watching in silence. Neither offered false reassurance. They knew as well as she did that old planes were unpredictable, that engines could seize, that mistakes could be unforgiving. Still, when Roy handed her the keys, his hand lingered a moment longer than usual. "She's ready," he said softly. "Question is, are you?" Wren swallowed hard and climbed into the cockpit. The seat cradled her like an old friend. She ran her fingers over the yoke, the switches, the throttle, each one a prayer disguised as metal. The logbook rested on the passenger seat, George's handwriting visible through the worn leather cover. Wren touched it once, grounding herself, then turned the key. The engine roared to life. Not a sputter, not a cough, but a steady, determined growl. The sound reverberated through the hangar walls and into Wren's bones. Her throat tightened as she pushed the throttle forward, the propeller slicing the air with a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. Echo was awake again. She taxied slowly, carefully, every nerve in her body taut. The runway stretched ahead, a strip of cracked pavement bordered by fields of tall grass. She paused at the end, taking one last deep breath. "All right, Echo," she whispered. "Let's see if you still remember." The throttle went forward. The plane shuddered, then surged. Wheels rattled across the pavement. Speed climbing, vibration shaking through her bones. For a terrifying second, she thought it wouldn't happen, that the plane would cling to the earth, heavy and unwilling. But then, almost imperceptibly, the ground fell away. Echo lifted, nose rising, wings catching the air like they'd been waiting 70 years for this moment. Tears blurred Wren's vision as the horizon tilted beneath her. The town shrank to toy-sized streets. The hangar became a speck. Her stomach lurched, but joy surged stronger than fear. The sky wrapped around her, endless and forgiving. For the first time in her life, she wasn't looking up at the sky. She was inside it. Roy's voice crackled faintly over the handheld radio he carried. "How's she feel?" Wren laughed, the sound choked with tears. "Alive," she said. "She feels alive." She circled once, then twice, the wind humming through the frame like a song remembered. The map and the star pressed at the edges of her mind, but for now, she didn't chase them. This flight wasn't about mystery or history. It was about proof that rust and ruin could rise again, that dreams could climb out of silence if someone was stubborn enough to believe in them. As she banked into the morning light, Wren whispered the name again, letting it echo into the open sky. Echo. The landing was smoother than Wren expected. Echo touched down with a soft bounce, wheels kissing the runway as if the earth had been waiting to welcome her home. She taxied back toward the hangar, heart still hammering, palms slick with sweat. Roy and Hank stood near the doors, their silhouettes sharp against the morning light. When she cut the engine, the silence was overwhelming, thick, electric, alive. She sat in the cockpit for a moment longer, letting the quiet wash over her, before finally climbing out. Roy didn't clap or cheer. He just nodded once, pride gleaming in his eyes. Hank grinned wide, his weathered face folding into deep lines. "You did it," he said. Wren shook her head. "We did it." She meant it. Echo had been resurrected not by her hands alone, but by every story, every scar, every person who believed the plane deserved another chance. Word spread fast. Within days, people from town came to the airfield just to see Echo. Some remembered hearing their parents talk about Georgia Ames, the daring pilot who vanished on a routine flight. Others simply wanted to glimpse a piece of history reborn. Wren didn't charge admission. She opened the hangar doors and let anyone step inside, watch, ask questions. She wasn't building a museum. She was sharing a legacy. At night, she returned to the map, tracing the star again and again. Part of her longed to follow it, to finish what Georgia had started. But she understood now that Echo's purpose wasn't only hidden in some desert airstrip, it was here, in the way people's eyes lit up when they saw her, in the way history whispered louder when you gave it breath again. The star would wait. For now, the work was here. Months passed. Wren began offering weekend lessons, teaching kids how to change oil, patch fabric, read old logbooks. The hangar became a gathering place, its walls ringing with laughter, argument, and the occasional hiss of a welding torch. People who had nothing in common found themselves united by rivets and dreams. Echo wasn't just a plane anymore, she was a bridge. One evening, long after the last visitor left, Wren sat alone in the cockpit with Georgia's logbook open on her lap. She turned to the final page. The ink faded, but steady. Don't just fly her. Make her yours. Wren traced the words with her fingertip, tears slipping down her cheek. She thought of her father, of the empty envelope on her desk that once held her future. She thought of Georgia, of the courage it took to fly into the unknown, and she thought of herself not the girl too scared to open college letters, but the woman who had pulled a ghost from the grave and given it wings again. Outside, the wind pressed against the hangar walls, rattling the doors. Echo creaked softly in response, as if answering. Wren smiled through her tears. "We did it, Georgia," she whispered. "We gave your story back its voice." And as twilight deepened across the quiet airfield, the girl who once traded her future for a broken plane realized she had built something far greater than a degree. She had given life back to a legend, and in the process, she had found her own.